In 1885, the great powers of Europe gathered in Berlin to settle the colonial partition of Africa, and buried inside the resulting treaty was a decision most textbooks strip of its actual mechanics. The conference recognized a new state in the heart of the Congo Basin, a territory roughly 80 times the size of Belgium, and granted sovereignty over it not to Belgium, not to any parliament or ministry, but to a single private man, Leopold II, King of the Belgians. The official record calls the result the Congo Free State, a name chosen for its resonance with the free trade principles the conference claimed to protect: free movement of goods, free navigation of the Congo River, free access for missionaries, traders, and explorers of every nation. That is the version repeated in survey courses and encyclopedia entries. What the financial record shows is a different arrangement. The Congo Free State was never a state in the ordinary sense. It carried Leopold's name the way a company carries the name of its founder, and from its first year it operated as his personal commercial holding, extracting the territory's ivory and rubber, while returning almost nothing to the people who lived on the land the treaty had assigned him. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The groundwork for Berlin had been laid years earlier, and it began not with a treaty, but with an association. In 1876, Leopold convened a geographic conference in Brussels and used it to found the International African Association, presented to the assembled scientists and explorers as a philanthropic body dedicated to abolishing the slave trade and opening Central Africa to civilization and commerce. Behind that public body sat a narrower entity Leopold controlled directly, the International Association of the Congo, which he used to fund the explorer Henry Morton Stanley on a series of expeditions between 1879 and 1884. Stanley's task was not scientific mapping, it was contract law. Traveling up the Congo River with a small escort, he negotiated more than 400 treaties with local chiefs, most of them illiterate in the languages the documents were written in, trading strips of cloth and token gifts for what the paper called cessions of land and sovereignty. The chiefs believed, where they understood the exchange at all, that they were agreeing to friendship and trade. The documents Stanley carried back to Brussels said something else. They said the signatories had surrendered their territory, its resources, and their own labor to the association and its successors in perpetuity. The treaties followed a printed template drafted in advance by Leopold's legal advisors, leaving blank only the name of the chief and a rough description of the territory in question. Local rulers who signed typically believed they were entering a trade relationship of the kind already familiar from decades of contact with Portuguese, Dutch, and Arab traders along the coast and the upper river. The clause that mattered in European courts, granting all sovereign and governing rights along with full ownership of the soil to the association and its successors, meant something entirely different in Brussels than it did on the riverbank, and no interpreter working for Stanley's expedition had any professional reason to explain the discrepancy to the men putting their marks on the page. By the time Leopold brought this file of signed treaties to the diplomats gathering in Berlin, he presented them as documentary proof that the territory had already consented to his authority, a claim no delegate at the conference had the means, or apparently the inclination, to verify independently. Leopold used those 400 treaties as the evidentiary basis on which he asked the Berlin Conference to recognize his personal claim over the Congo Basin, and he did so by presenting himself not as a monarch seeking territory, but as the head of a humanitarian trust acting on behalf of the international community. Portugal had its own historic claim to the mouth of the Congo River dating back to 15th century contact, and had spent much of the preceding decade pressing Britain to recognize that claim through a bilateral treaty signed in February of 1884, an agreement that collapsed almost immediately under a wave of criticism from British commercial and missionary interests who preferred an open trade zone to a Portuguese monopoly. That collapse left a vacuum at exactly the moment Leopold needed one, and it is a large part of why the conference, meeting in Bismarck's own chancellery building through the winter of 1884 and into February of the following year, proved willing to entertain his private claim at all. The maneuver worked because it served the interests of the larger powers at the table. Britain and France were each wary of the other controlling the Congo's river system and its access to the interior. Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had no colonial ambitions in the region and preferred a neutral buffer to a contested one. The United States, which had no colonial stake in Africa at all, recognized Leopold's association in April of 1884, months before the conference even opened, on the strength of lobbying by an American diplomat named Henry Shelton Sanford, who had been retained and paid by Leopold specifically to secure that recognition. By the time the conference convened in November, Leopold already had endorsements from Washington and from several European capitals. The remaining delegates folded the Congo Free State into the General Act as a settled matter rather than an open question, and Leopold walked out of Berlin as the sole sovereign of 1,876,000 square miles, an area larger than Britain, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy combined. The architecture Leopold then built to administer that territory had nothing resembling a legislature, a court system responsive to its residents, or a tax structure separate from his own accounts. In July of 1885, within months of the conference closing, Leopold issued a decree establishing what he called the domaine privé, the private domain. Under its terms, all land in the Congo Free State, not directly occupied by a village or under active cultivation by a local resident, was declared vacant, and therefore the personal property of the state, meaning of Leopold himself. Since Congolese land use rarely matched European conceptions of occupation and cultivation, the decree effectively transferred the overwhelming majority of the territory, including its rubber vines, its ivory-bearing elephant herds, and its mineral deposits, directly into Leopold's private ownership. A second decree in 1891 and a further one in 1892 extended the principle further, creating a zone known as the Domaine de la Couronne, the Crown Domain, roughly the size of France, whose revenues were directed exclusively to Leopold's personal treasury rather than even the nominal state budget of the Congo Free State. The distinction mattered because it meant Leopold had built two separate extraction channels, one dressed as government revenue and one that answered to no ledger outside his own household. The 1891 and 1892 decrees went further still, prohibiting Congolese residents of the affected districts from selling ivory or rubber to any private trader at all, reserving the entire harvest for the state and crown domain accounts, and making what had briefly been an open, if unequal, commercial market into a closed extraction system with a single legal buyer. The Belgian jurists who drafted these decrees justified the vacant land principle by pointing to European legal doctrines of terra nullius, the idea that unoccupied land belonged to no one and could therefore be claimed by whoever first established administrative control over it, a doctrine already familiar from colonial law in the Americas and Australia. Applying that doctrine to the Congo Basin required defining occupation so narrowly that shifting cultivation, seasonal hunting grounds, and communal forest use, the actual land practices of most Congolese communities, simply did not count, a definitional choice made entirely by the officials who stood to benefit from the resulting transfer. Financing this operation required capital Leopold did not have. His personal fortune, though substantial, could not cover the cost of steamboats, garrison posts, and the salaried European agents needed to enforce his claims across a territory that size. The Belgian state stepped in, though not as a colonial partner. Between 1889 and 1895, the Belgian parliament extended Leopold a series of loans, structured as advances against the Congo's future profitability, totaling around 32 million francs. Leopold also drew on the Brussels financial house Société Générale de Belgique, the country's dominant bank, which financed the corporate vehicles built to run the territory's commercial side. The chief of these was the Compagnie du Congo pour le commerce et l'industrie, generally abbreviated to its initials, which functioned as Leopold's holding company for railway concessions, river transport, and equity stakes in the extraction firms that followed. The Congo Free State, in other words, was capitalized like a business, carried debt like a business, and reported its returns to a board of Leopold's own appointees rather than to any Congolese institution, or for that matter, to the Belgian public whose government had underwritten the loans. The single largest capital project the Compagnie du Congo pour le commerce et l'industrie financed in this period was a railway connecting the port of Matadi to the young river settlement of Leopoldville, a route of roughly 240 miles, built to bypass a stretch of unnavigable rapids that otherwise cut the coast off from the entire upper river system and the rubber districts beyond it. Construction began in 1890 and took 8 years, financed through a mixture of Belgian state guarantee, private bond issues sold in Brussels and Antwerp, and equity from Leopold's own holding company. The line was built substantially with forced and indentured labor, including workers recruited under contract from West Africa, the Caribbean, and China once local recruitment fell short of the numbers the project required, and mortality during construction has been placed by company records and missionary accounts at several thousand deaths, attributed at the time to disease and terrain rather than to the labor regime that produced it. When the railway opened in 1898, its freight and passenger revenue became one more line item flowing back to the same small circle of Brussels shareholders who already held equity in the rubber concessions the line existed to serve. What the ledger shows once the machinery was running is the part of this story that the standard textbook account tends to compress into a single grim adjective and then move past. Ivory alone was never going to make the territory profitable at the scale Leopold required to service his debts and fund the ambitions he had for it. The market shifted in his favor in the early 1890s, when the invention of the pneumatic tire and the broader expansion of the rubber-dependent bicycle and automobile industries in Europe and the United States sent global rubber prices climbing sharply. The Congo Basin held vast stands of wild rubber vine, and Leopold's administration moved to extract it through a system of concessionary companies rather than direct state operation. The largest of these was the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber and Trading Company, generally known by its initials ABIR, chartered in 1892 and granted exclusive extraction rights across a concession in the Equator District, roughly the size of France. A second major concession, the Compagnie du Kasaï, operated under similar terms in the southern basin. Leopold's Domaine de la Couronne functioned as a third channel, extracting rubber directly under his personal account rather than through an intermediary company at all. In each case, the legal structure was the same, a joint stock company in which Leopold's own holding vehicle retained a substantial equity stake, frequently 50%, meaning that whatever brutality the concession required to hit its quota, the profits from that brutality flowed in part directly back to the crown. ABIR's founding capital came from a group of Antwerp trading houses alongside Leopold's own holding vehicle, which held a stake close to half the company's shares through a nominee arrangement that kept the king's direct involvement out of the prospectus circulated to outside investors. The same ownership pattern, a nominally private company with the crown holding a concealed equity position behind it, repeated across the other major concessions, meaning that whatever dividend a concession paid its shareholders at the close of a fiscal year, a substantial portion of it returned to Brussels regardless of which name appeared on the company's public letterhead. The enforcement mechanism behind the rubber quotas was a paramilitary force called the Force Publique, initially organized in 1888 and expanded through the 1890s to a strength of roughly 19,000 men by the end of the decade, commanded by a small cadre of European officers and staffed largely by African soldiers recruited or conscripted from other parts of the continent. Village chiefs were assigned rubber quotas they were required to meet on a fixed schedule, and the Force Publique enforced those quotas using a hostage system in which women and children were held in company posts until the men of the village returned from the forest with the required weight of latex. Failure to meet quota was punished with the chicotte, a whip made of dried hippopotamus hide, and with reprisal raids on villages that fell short. Force Publique officers were issued a fixed ration of ammunition per soldier and were required to account for every cartridge fired, a bookkeeping requirement intended to prevent soldiers from selling ammunition on the side. The system that emerged to satisfy that accounting requirement was the practice for which the Congo Free State became infamous, even among contemporaries. Soldiers were ordered to bring back a severed human hand for every cartridge expended, as physical proof that the round had been fired at a person, rather than sold or wasted. Company officials in some concessions, ABIR chief among them, extended the practice into a bonus system, paying commissions to agents and soldiers based on rubber tonnage delivered, which created a direct financial incentive layered on top of the ammunition accounting to maximize both extraction and violence in the same transaction. District officials competed openly for the highest tonnage delivered from their posts, since bonus pay and promotion within the concessionary companies tracked those figures directly. One of the most notorious of these officials, an ABIR district commissioner named Léon Fievez, was later documented in testimony gathered by missionaries and by Casement himself as having described, without apparent concern for how it would read, the number of villages his forces had burned in a single district to bring quota compliance back into line, and company correspondence from his post recorded rubber deliveries rising sharply in the periods when his methods were at their most severe. Fievez was never prosecuted for any of it, and was in fact commended within the company hierarchy for his production record, a detail later investigators cited as evidence that the violence was not a breakdown of the system, but a feature its incentive structure was built to reward. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The revenue this system generated moved through a small number of accounts that all led back to Brussels. Rubber exports from the Congo Free State rose from around 100 tons in 1887 to roughly 6,000 tons annually by the turn of the century, and at the price rubber commanded through the 1890s, the territory's net profit to Leopold personally has been estimated by Belgian financial historians at somewhere between 70 million and 120 million francs across the 2 decades of his direct rule, figures that do not include the separate returns booked by ABIR and the Kasaï Company to their outside shareholders in London and Antwerp. Leopold directed a substantial share of what reached him personally into a construction program in Belgium itself, a program he referred to privately as his travaux, his works. The Triumphal Arch and Museum Complex at the Cinquantenaire Park in Brussels, the Royal Glasshouses at Laeken, the Seaside Promenade and Hippodrome at Ostend, and the Palace of the Colonies at Tervuren, later renamed the Royal Museum for Central Africa, were all financed substantially from Congo revenue, often routed through the Crown domain account that never appeared in the Congo Free State's public budget at all. Leopold justified the museum at Tervuren explicitly as a public relations exhibit, staffed at its 1897 opening with 267 Congolese men, women, and children brought to Belgium and housed in a mock village on the museum grounds for visitors to view. A display that framed the territory as a benevolent civilizing project for a domestic audience that had no independent means of learning what the rubber quotas actually cost. Even that carefully staged exhibit carried a cost the museum's own later records confirmed. At least 7 of the 267 people brought to Belgium for it died from cold and illness during their months on the museum grounds and were buried nearby in graves that went unmarked until archival researchers identified them decades later. Leopold personally advanced several million francs to complete the Triumphal Arch and its flanking exhibition halls at the Cinquantenaire in time for Belgium's 75th anniversary as an independent state in 1905, presenting the finished monument to the public as a royal gift rather than disclosing that the funds behind it had been drawn from the same Crown domain account into which Congo rubber revenue flowed. What they cost in demographic terms remains a subject of active historical debate precisely because the Congo Free State kept no comprehensive census either before or during Leopold's rule, a gap that is itself part of the record rather than an accident of poor archiving. The Belgian government's own Commission of Inquiry, convened under domestic and international pressure in 1904 and reporting the following year, declined to produce a specific mortality figure, but confirmed that the population of the territories under concession had fallen sharply, that the rubber tax was collected through systematic violence, and that colonial officials at every level were aware of the mutilation practice and had done nothing to stop it. Later historians working from missionary records, trade company logs, and comparative population estimates taken before and after the rubber period have proposed death tolls that vary widely depending on method. The American historian Adam Hochschild, whose 1998 account of the period brought the casement material back into general public attention, cited estimates approaching 10 million. Belgian historians, including Jean-Luc Velout, have argued for more cautious figures given how thin the surviving population data actually is, while still affirming that the decline was severe and directly attributable to the rubber regime rather than to disease or famine occurring independently of it. The wide range across these estimates reflects how little baseline data existed to begin with, and how much of what did exist was destroyed, never kept, or never extended to the districts furthest from the river posts in the first place. What is not in dispute in any serious historical account is the mechanism, a private commercial entity, financed by Belgian loans and Brussels banking capital, extracted a cash crop through a quota and hostage system, enforced by an armed force answerable only to the concession holders and the Crown, and the human cost of that system was treated in the accounting as an operating expense rather than a consequence requiring correction. Some of the earliest and most consequential documentation came not from any government official, but from missionaries stationed along the upper river. A British Baptist missionary named Alice Seeley Harris, working at a mission station in the Equator District, began photographing survivors of punitive raids as early as 1904, including a widely circulated image of a Congolese man named Nsala, seated beside the severed hand and foot of his young daughter, killed by Force Publique soldiers after his village fell short of its rubber quota. Harris and her husband John distributed the photographs to reform campaigners in Britain, and the images were later projected on lantern slides during public lectures organized by the Congo Reform Association, giving audiences an ocean away from the rubber districts a form of evidence that testimony alone had struggled to supply. The record that eventually forced a reckoning did not originate inside Leopold's administration. It came from a British consular official named Roger Casement, posted to the Congo Free State by the Foreign Office, and instructed in 1903 to investigate mounting reports from missionaries about conditions in the rubber districts. Casement spent several months traveling the Congo and Kasai rivers, interviewing villagers, missionaries, and company agents directly, and recording testimony that included first-hand accounts of the hand-severing practice, of hostage-taking, and of entire villages destroyed for failing to meet quota. His report, submitted to the Foreign Office and published in February of 1904, ran to over 60 pages of documented testimony and became known simply as the Casement Report. Its publication galvanized a reform campaign already underway in Britain, led by a shipping company clerk turned journalist named Edmond de Morel, who had noticed years earlier while auditing shipping manifests for a Liverpool firm that vessels leaving the Congo for Antwerp arrived full of rubber and ivory, while vessels departing Antwerp for the Congo carried almost nothing but rifles, chains, and ammunition. A trade imbalance that made no commercial sense unless the rubber was being extracted rather than purchased. Morel's method had begun as accounting rather than moral argument. Working from Lloyd's shipping registers and Belgian trade statistics he could access through his position at the Liverpool shipping firm Elder Dempster, he had calculated years earlier that the value of rubber and ivory leaving the Congo Free State consistently and substantially exceeded any plausible purchase price the territory's own published trade figures could account for, meaning the commodities were being extracted rather than bought at anything resembling market terms. He published these findings beginning in 1900, first in pamphlet form and later in a periodical he founded called the West African Mail, building a documentary case in financial terms years before Casement's field testimony gave the campaign its human dimension. Morel founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904, specifically to publicize the Casement findings and press for an end to Leopold's personal rule over the territory. And the combined pressure from Morel's trade analysis and Casement's testimony reached the United States Congress as well, which passed a resolution in 1906 urging the president to use diplomatic channels to press for reform, a rare instance of American legislative attention to a European colonial administration in this period. The American writer Mark Twain joined the campaign the following year, publishing a satirical pamphlet titled King Leopold's Soliloquy that imagined the king defending his record to himself in private, a text that circulated widely on both sides of the Atlantic and helped move the story from a specialist colonial affairs debate into general public awareness. Faced with an international reform movement that included the governments of Britain and the United States applying direct diplomatic pressure, Leopold's own administration was forced to convene its Commission of Inquiry in 1904, staffed with officials Leopold expected to produce a defense of his record. Instead, the Commission's findings, delivered in 1905, corroborated the substance of the Casement report closely enough that Leopold could no longer credibly deny the pattern, even as his government continued to dispute the scale. The admission, when it came, was never a public confession. It arrived instead as a negotiated exit. Under continuing pressure from the Belgian parliament, which had its own reasons to want the international embarrassment resolved, and facing the prospect that Britain or the international community might act unilaterally, Leopold agreed in principle during 1907 to transfer sovereignty over the Congo Free State to the Belgian state. The transfer was formalized by an act of the Belgian Parliament on the 18th of October 1908, and the territory was renamed the Belgian Congo, taking effect the following month. The terms of that transfer are the part of the story that rarely makes it into the summary version because they show the deal was never a surrender in any financial sense. Leopold did not hand over the Congo Free State for nothing. The annexation agreement required the Belgian state to assume the roughly 110 million francs in debt the Congo Free State had accumulated, much of it debt Leopold's own administration had generated, and to pay Leopold personally a further 50 million francs, styled in the agreement as compensation for what the treaty called his sacrifices for the Congo. Leopold also retained control, through separate arrangements, over funds already allocated to his Belgian building projects, meaning that even after losing formal sovereignty over the territory, he continued to draw on Congo-derived capital for construction projects inside Belgium for the remaining months of his life. The Belgian parliament debated the 50 million franc payment for weeks before ratifying it, with a minority of socialist deputies arguing that a state formally acknowledging the abuses documented by its own commission of inquiry had no obligation to compensate the man responsible for them, but the annexation bill passed regardless, on the calculation that resolving the international embarrassment mattered more than the precedent the payment set. He died in December of 1909, roughly 13 months after the transfer, having governed the Congo as personal property for 23 years, and having converted its extraction revenue into a domestic architectural legacy that stands in Brussels and Ostend to this day, largely disconnected in public memory from the source of the capital that built it. The institution Leopold created did not disappear with the transfer of sovereignty. It changed ownership and continued operating on substantially the same extraction logic under the Belgian state. The Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, chartered in 1906 in the final years of Leopold's personal rule, specifically to develop copper deposits in the Katanga region, survived the transition to Belgian Congo intact and became the colonial administration's dominant mining concern for the next half-century, later expanding into the cobalt and uranium deposits that would make Katanga strategically significant well beyond Belgium's own borders, including supplying the uranium used in the first American atomic weapons during the 1940s. The forced labor system that had defined the rubber quota years was formally curtailed after 1908, but persisted in modified form under compulsory cultivation requirements and labor conscription for mining and infrastructure projects that continued into the 1920s and beyond, run now by a colonial civil service rather than by concessionary rubber companies, but drawing on the same underlying premise that the territory's resources existed to be extracted for capital that would be spent somewhere else. The compulsory labor obligation was reframed legally as a tax payable in work rather than currency, a change in wording that preserved the underlying extraction relationship while removing Leopold's name and the rubber-era vocabulary from the arrangement. Union Minière's Katanga operations expanded through the 1910s and 1920s on a workforce assembled through a mixture of paid contract labor and continued compulsory requisition, and the copper, and later the uranium and cobalt, drawn from the same deposits that had first attracted Leopold's surveyors, remained central to colonial revenue for the whole of the territory's history as the Belgian Congo, right up to independence in 1960. The financial thread running from the Berlin Conference to the present day has never fully broken. The Democratic Republic of Congo, independent since 1960, sits on the same mineral wealth that drew Leopold's attention to the Katanga concessions more than a century ago, and cobalt from that same geological formation now supplies a substantial share of the mineral used in lithium-ion batteries for the global electronics and electric vehicle industry, extracted in many cases through artisanal mining operations under labor conditions that international monitors have repeatedly flagged for their own quota pressures and safety failures. Belgium's own reckoning with the record arrived only recently and only partially. In June of 2020, King Philippe, Leopold's great-great-grandnephew, sent a letter to Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi, expressing what the letter called his deepest regrets for the wounds of the colonial past, the first acknowledgement of its kind by a reigning Belgian monarch, though the letter stopped short of a formal apology and made no reference to reparations. The statue of Leopold that stood for decades in central Brussels was removed from public display in the same year, following protests that drew explicit comparisons between the Congo Free State's ledger and its human cost. In 2022, Belgium went a step further and returned the only remaining physical relic connected to Patrice Lumumba, the Congo's first elected prime minister after independence, whose assassination in 1961 involved Belgian government complicity, later confirmed by a Belgian parliamentary inquiry concluded in 2001. The relic, a single gold-capped tooth kept for decades by a Belgian police officer involved in disposing of Lumumba's remains, was handed to his family in a ceremony in Brussels, a gesture campaigners described as another partial and long-delayed acknowledgement of a colonial record Belgium has still not addressed through any formal program of reparations. What the record still shows, a century and a half after the Berlin Conference folded a private commercial claim into the language of international law, is a mineral economy in Central Africa still structured to move capital outward, still generating wealth that is counted and spent somewhere other than where it was extracted, on a foundation the General Act of 1885 never disclosed to the people who were living on the land it signed away. The company Leopold built in 1885 never fully closed its books. It only changed the names on the letterhead. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.